Buenas tardes a todos. Mi nombre es Juan Sebastián Galán, profesor de Economía en la Universidad de los Andes. Hoy tengo el orgullo de presentar a nuestro conferencista, aunque no creo que realmente lo necesite. Por eso, más que presentarlo, quisiera presentarles una forma particular de mirar al país. Quisiera comenzar con una anécdota. Hace unos años, cuando James estaba realizando su año sabático en Bogotá, fuimos a presenciar las primeras audiencias en las que antiguos comandantes paramilitares de las AUC comparecieron ante magistrados para ser juzgados por la guerra que desataron. Al comienzo, el énfasis de los fiscales estaba en preguntar por los crímenes cometidos, pero pronto la evidencia reveló la complejidad del fenómeno. No solo habían cometido asesinatos y masacres, sino que también habían recaudado impuestos, resuelto disputas, delimitado derechos de propiedad, regulado mercados y en algunas zonas incluso proveyeron bienes públicos como colegios y hospitales. Sorprendido, en una de esas audiencias un magistrado le preguntó a uno de los comandantes: «Explíqueme, ¿cómo es que ustedes hicieron todo esto?». El antiguo comandante contestó: «Su señoría, esa es la pregunta. ¿Cómo fue posible que existiera un pequeño Estado independiente como el que creamos dentro del Estado de Derecho colombiano?». Siento que responder a esta contrapregunta, aparentemente simple, pero profundamente reveladora para todos en ese momento, ha estado detrás del gran viaje intelectual que James ha desarrollado en Colombia desde hace más de 3 décadas. La búsqueda de una respuesta lo han llevado de vuelta al pasado, a estudiar la esclavitud y la arquitectura legal del Estado, la persistencia de las élites políticas, la desigualdad de la tierra, el clientelismo, las normas antisociales, la parapolítica y hasta más recientemente la gobernanza paramilitar. Y lo ha hecho en equipo, impulsando desinteresadamente en el camino a decenas de estudiantes y profesores uniandinos, entre los cuales me cuento como uno más, afortunado. Muchos de ellos se encuentran hoy aquí, otros en el sector público o privado dentro y fuera de Colombia. James ha leído mucho, claro, y escarbado archivos, pero también ha recorrido el país, visitando lugares a los que muchos colombianos prefieren no ir. Ha hablado tanto con expresidentes de la República y cacaos empresariales, como con campesinos humildes y líderes sociales en veredas recónditas, y a todos, en lo que me consta, los oye por igual. Todo este trabajo le ha permitido contribuir al debate público y a reinterpretar los problemas fundamentales del país. Desde su mirada, estos no provienen de nuestras montañas o selvas. Como le he oído a James decir, la historia de la humanidad es la de sobreponerse a la geografía, no la de sucumbir ante ella. Tampoco provienen de la falta de ideas. El país no carece de diagnósticos ni de comisiones de expertos, sean internacionales o nacionales, ni de diseños institucionales sofisticados. Pero el desarrollo no se decreta, mucho menos se importa. Los grandes males que solemos asociar con nuestro rezago económico, el narcotráfico, los grupos armados, la ilegalidad, la corrupción, no son sino síntomas de un problema político más profundo, el Estado disfuncional. Tiene que ver con cómo el Estado central ha interactuado históricamente con la periferia, dejando vastas áreas prácticamente ingobernadas, y con cómo se distribuye el poder entre las élites nacionales y regionales, no solo a través de la política, sino también a través de comportamientos sociales y culturales que reproducimos a diario. Desde esta lectura, Colombia no ha construido un Estado ausente, sino un Estado de palancas. Funciona mejor en algunos territorios, es débil en otros. Es eficaz para ciertos grupos y prácticamente irrelevante para otros. Esa arbitrariedad no es accidental, sino el resultado de equilibrios políticos de largo plazo. Esta manera de mirar al país nos da luces para explicar por qué tantos intentos de cambiarlo también han fracasado. No basta con buenas ideas o políticas públicas. Muchas soluciones que se han intentado durante décadas, desde la reforma agraria de López Pumarejo hasta la que impulsa el gobierno actual hoy, chocan una y otra vez en su implementación con intereses políticos profundamente arraigados. Los intentos por retomar el control territorial del Estado desde arriba, mediante el uso de la fuerza, pueden tener consecuencias violentas devastadoras, como cuando ocurrió con los falsos positivos. Y los intentos por hacerlo desde abajo, a través de la movilización de la sociedad civil, como con los PEDETs, tras el acuerdo de paz con las FARC, terminan capturados también. Algunas personas reaccionan ante esta mirada con pesimismo. Nos enfrentamos, sin duda, al desafío político de pensar soluciones que alteren las relaciones de poder entre el centro y la periferia. Yo, en cambio, no pierdo esperanza. El gran aporte de James no es ofrecer un manual de soluciones, sino obligarnos a entendernos mejor y a hacernos mejores preguntas. Preguntas incómodas, sí, pero necesarias, porque somos los colombianos quienes estamos llamados a encontrar colectivamente la manera de cambiar nuestro destino. Entonces, ¿por dónde empezar? A finales del siglo XIX, el intelectual cubano y defensor de la democracia José Martí escribió Nuestra América, un llamado a que América Latina construyera instituciones acordes con su historia y su realidad política, en lugar de copiar los modelos ajenos de Estados Unidos y de Europa. Martí escribió, y abro comillas, ni el libro europeo ni el libro estadounidense pueden dar la clave del enigma latinoamericano. Se probó el odio y los países venían cada año a menos. Cansados del odio inútil, de la resistencia del libro contra la lanza, de la ciudad contra el campo, del imperio imposible de las castas urbanas divididas sobre la nación natural tempestuosa e inerte. Se ponen de pie los países y se saludan. ¿Cómo somos?, se preguntan, y unos a otros se van diciendo cómo son. Les propongo empezar, tal vez, por preguntarnos cómo somos en esta conferencia. La Facultad de Economía quiere celebrar este legado y quiere construir sobre él. El ejemplo de James nos muestra el poder de la academia, el de transformar la manera de pensar. Nos invita a apostar aún más por investigaciones que retomen estas y otras preguntas, las profundicen y las respondan, incluso desde miradas diferentes. Por eso hemos creado la James Robinson Annual Lecture, una conferencia anual organizada por la Facultad de Economía, abierta al público en general, que inauguramos hoy y en la que invitaremos cada año a un académico o académica cuyas contribuciones sean relevantes para el debate público colombiano. No podríamos comenzar con un mejor invitado. Ayúdenme a darle la bienvenida a nuestro profesor honorario de la facultad, Premio Nobel de Economía 2024, James Robinson.
Okay. Where are you going? Okay, great. Thank you, Juan Sebastián. Thank you very much. Voy a hablar en inglés, desafortunadamente. I'm obviously super happy and delighted and very honored to be here, very honored to be giving the James Robinson lecture. It's not clear to me if you're going to be able to get anybody else to present the James Robinson lecture. So just in case, I'm available next year. Okay, and today I wanted to just do something fun and a little bit different, seemed appropriate for the event. I'm going to present some research with my collaborator, José Luis Falconi. José Luis is he's a professor of art at the University of Connecticut. He's not a social scientist. And I put all of the institutions with which I'm affiliated up there, including Los Andes, since Economia gave me I'm now a kind of, I don't know what I am. I'm an honorary member of the department, so I'm very excited about that. And I won't talk about the University of Nigeria. So this is work with José Luis and I have been doing for the last few years about the kind of political economy, but also the culture of Latin America, trying to kind of embed the political economy in the culture of Latin America. And it's really, the way I'm going to start talking about this is, and the way Jose Luis and I started talking about it is like things we don't understand. You know, what is it we don't understand? And how could we understand them? So let me start with an example of things that we felt we didn't understand. And then I'm going to propose a way of thinking about this. Okay? So this is, I guess this is Bolivar, probably. He calls it like, you know, the technical disqualification. So let me tell you the story. 5 years ago, it was the bicentenary in Peru, and the Peruvian government decided to have exhibitions and shows and different events, and they asked people to put forward proposals for what they would organize and how would they organize this and who would be involved. So they started a competition, and a gentleman and his team, Miguel Lopez, was declared the winner of this competition. But it was a very strange sort of competition. There were 120 teams proposed projects of events and what was going to happen, what would celebrate the bicentennial of Peru. And every single one of those teams, except for Miguel Lopez, was ruled inadmissible. Okay? So the technical disqualification was, it wasn't that their proposals were bad, they were just disqualified on technical grounds. They missed the deadline, they forgot to fill out a form, they proposed a sort of activity which it had been specifically stipulated the bicentennial would not involve. So some technical reason ruled out 119 of these proposals. Okay, and Miguel Lopez says, you know, I'm sorry. Instead of celebrating to win, he says, I'm sorry to find myself in the middle of this situation. Okay, I'm part of the team that was declared fit, the only team, to our great regret and disappointment. So he'd won, but he hadn't really won, because in the end he was the only person, his team was the only team involved. Okay, so it seems very dysfunctional to us. So how do you understand something like that? Okay, so I don't think this is a case of course, Miguel Lopez had a kind of vested interest in winning, but only in a trivial sense, it seems to us. You know, he didn't bribe the judge or the jury to disqualify the 119, okay? And in fact, he was genuinely embarrassed about winning this competition. And to us, the technical disqualification seems like a fantastic example, and you're going to get many other examples in the next hour, of a clash between what the great Uruguayan intellectual Ángel Rama called the clash between the real and the ideal. There's an ideal way of making a proposal for the bicentennial, but in reality, it's almost impossible to satisfy that ideal. And that leads to the disqualification of 119 of these different projects. Okay? And for Rama, in his book La Ciudad Letrada, he sort of says, a key aspect of Latin American society is that it privileges potentiality over reality. Okay? All right? And the clash between the real and the ideal. Okay? So the potential was represented by all these rules that had to be followed to submit a proposal for the bicentennial, but the reality was it's almost impossible to satisfy all of those rules. Okay? So the real and the ideal. I'm going to try to provide some kind of micro foundation, we like to say, in economics for that, but let me make it a bit more kind of abstract. Okay? And the abstract is, you know, typically we think there's A and there's not A. And, you know, if one of them is true, the other one is false, you know, and if we discover that A is false and not A is correct, then we replace A with not A, okay? Or if A is believed to be the accepted or usual practice, and there's an alternative, even if it's contradictory, we have to choose one or the other. But we think that many things in Latin America can be sort of explained by a different model, where instead of replacing one with the other, you sort of accept both of them on top of each other or beside each other. Okay? You layer them or you put one beside each other. So let me give you an example. The religious syncretism is a wonderful example. Okay? Here's an example of two contradictory things layered on top of each other. Okay? At the bottom you have Coricancha, which was the Inca, this is in Cusco, in Peru, it's the Inca temple of the sun, Coricancha. And on top of it, you can see, absolutely layered, physically on top of it, is the Convento de Santo Domingo. Okay? So they came, the Incas had a temple, they put the church on top of the temple. Okay? So we think religious syncretism, in some sense, is a kind of metaphor for what we're talking about. And actually, it's a very good example of sustaining multiple kind of realities that apparently are contradictory, but at the same time. Okay? There's lots of issues here, and I'll try to talk about some of them. Okay? So think about, I'll come back to religious syncretism, but if you think about that as a metaphor of sort of like, you know, Coricancha, that we put the church on top, we think that's a sort of metaphor, okay? In the sense that if you think about the history of Latin America, the modernization hasn't really taken the form of, you know, modernity replacing something previous to it. It's amounted to adding things alongside so that kind of multiple realities coexist at the same time, okay? And the Coricancha is a sort of example of that. And that might be fine, but what's it got to do with the real and the ideal? Well, I think that's to do with utopianism. Okay? So to understand this layering, this kind of putting A and not A next to each other or on top of each other, I want you to think about that as the real and the ideal nestling next to each other. It sounds like they're contradictory, but think of them like Coricancha and the Convento de Santo Domingo. But where does the ideal come from? The ideal comes from this great history of utopianism in Latin America. Okay? So, you know, the best example of that, of course, would be Brasilia. Okay? So Brasilia was, I don't know, what is it? Is it a bird? Is it a plane? You know, it was designed, this is the plan piloto, you know, of Brasilia, of this kind of utopian vision of Brazil, of this country of progress. And as de Gaulle said, this sounds very pejorative, but I'm going to come back and reinterpret this quote by the end of the lecture. Brazil is the country of the future and always will be, de Gaulle said. Okay, so here's the country of the future, utopianism. Okay, but of course, utopianism is sort of deeply embedded in Latin America, it's deeply embedded in Colombian culture and society, and that's where the ideal comes in. Utopianism is about the ideal. You know, so Angel Rama, again, talking about the invention of the Americas, you know, particularly the cities. He focuses very much, La Ciudad Letrada, he focuses on the cities and how the cities in Latin America became an embodiment of utopian, of ideal plans, beautifully planned grids. And he says, you know, and Latin American cities have ever been the creation of the human mind. The lands of the new continent afforded a propitious place for the dream of the ordered city to become a reality. Okay, so you can think of the technical disqualification of an attempt to sort of fit or impose a utopian idea of what such a process of organizing the bicentennial should look like on top of the reality. Okay? Now, there's lots of things to understand here. In particular, how can you sustain kind of in equilibrium this juxtaposition of A and not A? How can religious syncretism occur? And how these things are mutually contradictory. Why doesn't one win or why doesn't the other win? Okay, so these are the questions to ask yourself. Okay, but I want you to have two images. This image of Coricancha and like this layering and adding. We don't replace, we layer, we add. And we can add contradictory things. And why would we have the real and the ideal? Well, that's where utopianism comes in, okay? What's absent is the feedback loop, okay? So this is something I've noticed for many years in Colombian public policy, for example. You try to implement something, you don't implement it, but you never learn about why you didn't implement it or why you were unable to implement it. You just come with a new project and a new proposal. There's a feedback loop that's kind of missing there, okay? So how to think about that feedback loop, okay? And in fact, what you see in the small and in the large, whether it's tax reform or constitutional change, is that when something doesn't work out or when there's this disequilibrium between the real and the ideal, you just come with a new ideal plan. What's the best example of that? The best example of that is constitution writing, okay? Now, I'm English. We don't even have a constitution in England, But only Latin Americans think you can solve these problems by writing constitutions. Even in Africa, nobody thinks in Africa you can solve problems by writing a constitution. And here's the history. This is from my colleague at the law school, Tom Ginsberg's kind of historical project of he basically created a data set of all the world's constitution going back to the French constitution. And the dark lines are new constitutions, like rewriting constitutions, and the light lines are, amendments to the constitution. So the República Dominicana, wins. It's the Latin American countries with the most constitutions since independence. But the idea here is sort of like you adjust to, Colombia has far fewer, of course, than far fewer actual constitutions, or Argentina doesn't have many constitutions. But you adjust to the disequilibrium with coming with a new utopian project, okay? So that's the response to the disequilibrium. That doesn't explain the lack of a feedback loop, but I'm going to come to that, okay? So, if you go back to Coricancha and you think about the feedback loop, like the Spanish come, and the indigenous people would like to maintain their culture and their religion, and the church comes, and so they pretend to believe. So, so they go through the motions and they come to church, and so you can understand why the indigenous people kind of want to have those two things. The more difficult thing to understand is why it's okay from the Spanish point of view. So for the Catholic Church, it's okay if the indigenous people just go through the motions. They don't really have to convert. It's sufficient that they go through the motions, okay? So that's trying to get into this. Why is there no feedback loop? And why is it that the Catholic Church is somehow happy to just let these two things coexist? Okay? Here's an example, and I'm going to give lots of Colombian examples coming up of this ideal and real and the contradictory things coming next to each other. Okay? But here's an example that everybody knows. Obedezco pero no cumplo, okay? So this principle, I obey but I do not comply. So the usual interpretation of this is the Spanish crown issues laws. In Americas, they're like, I obey, meaning I recognize your right to pass laws, but I do not comply, meaning I keep my right to not enforce them, okay? So that's a kind of, you're autonomous. The criollos in Latin America, they don't want Spain to control them. But another way of thinking about that, a different interpretation of that from our perspective, is the crown in Spain is issuing laws that are completely ideal and impractical. And the people in Latin America, they kind of understand they're impractical. So I obedezco pero no cumplo is like the clash between the real and the ideal, okay? It's like you can issue your laws, that's the ideal. I don't comply, that's the real, okay? So that also comes out of this disequilibrium between the real and the ideal, okay? And it's a bit like the example on the previous page of how come it's sufficient if the indigenous people don't really convert, they just show up to church? How come from the Spanish point of view, it's sufficient if the Latin Americans obey but they don't comply? That's okay, all right? It's sufficient, okay? And we think the answer to this is in the Counter-Reformation. If you trace back this lack of a feedback loop, if you trace back this willingness to kind of be content with mutually inconsistent things, you have to go back to the Counter-Reformation and the decisions of the Catholic Church of how to deal with the Reformation, how to deal with the Protestants. Do we make concessions? Do we make doctrinal concessions to the Protestants? Do we try to get people? And the Council of Trent said, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to make any concessions to the Protestants. But we have to live with the Protestants. How are we going to live with the Protestants? Well, at the same time as that debate was going on, of course, the whole artistic movement of the baroque happened, okay? And what is the baroque about? The baroque, so now you know why I'm writing a paper with a professor of art. The baroque is about encompassing everything, okay? So here's a very famous a baroque church in Cholula in Mexico, where, as the way people usually talk about this, of course, the baroque artistic movement came at a time, of the Counter-Reformation, of trying to make the Catholic Church appeal to people to look wonderful, to look rich, to look enticing, but it was also, in some sense, a metaphor for the coexistence of Catholicism and the Protestant religion, which was something that they decided at the Council of Trent, okay? So everything can be fitted in and everything can be added in the Baroque. There's no center, okay? And so this is the real and the ideal, and it's A and not A. It's Coricancha, it's the Temple of the Sun, and it's the Convent of Santo Domingo, all coexisting, all right? So we would say, I started with this real and ideal, and how can these things coexist? The way we think about that is it's deeply ingrained in this culture of the Baroque, which was transmitted from Spain and, Catholic Europe to Latin America. It's not just about the Baroque, but it's also about the utopian aspect of things too, which of course is deeply connected to the discovery of the Americas. All right. Now you're thinking, okay, he's sort of proposing, and I'm going to give lots of examples of clientelism and things like that in a minute, but, it looks like, when you see a title like The Fundamental Disequilibrium in Latin America, you think okay, he's proposing yet another explanation for why everything is a mess in Latin America. And I am, but there's more to it than that. And there's always what we call a plus one. What do I mean by that? Think about this metaphor of adding things. You add things, something comes, you add it, you add it, you add it, and something emerges out of that. Something new comes out of that. What in physics, in theoretical physics, they call it emergent phenomena. What do I mean by that? A Brazilian buffet. Okay, what's a Brazilian buffet? If you go to this Fogão de Chão restaurant, I don't know if they have that in Bogota. I'm sure, it's everything. A Brazilian buffet is everything. It's like Japanese, it's everything. Manioc, Italian, Spanish, you name it. It's all, there it is. But it's not just the sum. The whole is not just the sum of the parts. Okay, it's a Brazilian buffet, maybe ceviche would be an even better example, okay? What is ceviche? It's like potatoes, Andean food, it's like raw fish from Japan, it's like Italian, but what comes out is ceviche. A ceviche is not any one of those individual parts. Ceviche is an emergent phenomenon, okay? So we think in some sense, this adding is like a Latin American model of innovation or creativity so yeah, there's lots of problems with this model of society, this cultural model, but we're also going to argue that actually there's lots of very interesting and creative things about that, and that's partly what's distinct about Latin America and good about Latin America. So it's more than, maybe this looks like a trivial example, but I'll give you some more later. Okay, so just, it's more than the sum of the parts. It's not just an explanation for dysfunction. It's also a model of creativity. All right. Okay, so roadmap. Okay. What am I going to do for the rest of the talk? Well, let me give you some examples of this disequilibrium in action. And I'm going to give neoliberal policy reform in Argentina, and then I'm going to start with my Colombian examples, which is Colombian land restitution in Meta, okay, which we think is a great example of this dysfunctionality. Okay. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about why Latin America is different from North America. Of course, North America had utopianism, like William Penn, the Puritans. There were lots of utopians. But of course, what North America didn't have was the Counter-Reformation. So the United States developed a much more, our argument is, a much more empirical way. There's more of a feedback loop in the United States. So it's not clear that utopianism is the difference, but this feedback loop is the difference. I'll have to talk a little bit about that. And then I'll try to convince you, I gave you this, talked about this famous adage, obedezco pero no cumplo. I'm going to give you some other examples from Latin America, which we think this way of thinking helps think about in a new way. One is going to be inequality. Another is the pervasiveness of clientelism in Latin America. And another is, the magical state, the magic of the state. This is something, it's mostly about Venezuela, but okay. And then let's see where I get in magical realism. Okay. So let me talk about neoliberal policy reform. How would you think about these ideas in the context of neoliberal policy reform in Argentina? Well, here it is, utopia libertaria. So President Milei is imposing, as we speak, a completely utopian model of how an economy and society should function, and clashing with the reality of Argentina. But of course, this is not the first time this has happened in Argentina. Okay, if you go back to the 1990s, when President Menem, 1989, President Carlos Menem came to power, the traditional narrative of this would be, okay, this was the era of the Washington Consensus. President Menem, he was a traditional Peronist. He came from the provinces, from La Rioja, but he was convinced by the World Bank, or whoever it was, that he should abandon the bad old days of the Peronists and adopt neoliberal reform. And in a sense, he did. But how would you think about this from my perspective? Well, there's the old Peronist, clientelistic way of doing things, and then there's neoliberal reform. Would you expect neoliberal reform to replace the old Peronist way? No. You'd expect it to be put on top of it or put beside it. You'd expect people to incorporate both. And in fact, if you look now at the academic literature on neoliberal reform in Argentina in the 1990s, that's exactly what happened. Okay? That neoliberal reform did come, but it was made compatible. It was put alongside the traditional way of doing politics in Argentina. Okay, so, and how did that happen? As Steve Levitsky, political scientist Steve Levitsky says in his book, about transforming Argentina, the PJ, the Peronist Party, underwent a stunning about-face. The stunning about-face happens when Carlos Menem embraces the Washington Consensus. Okay, but then what Levitsky also points out is that, well, what was the secret? President Menem realized that many aspects of Washington Consensus could be just adapted to the usual way of doing politics. privatization, for example. Carlos Slim in Mexico acquired his fortune through neoliberal privatization in Mexico. In Argentina, privatizing assets was compatible with rewarding the supporters of the Peronist party. So then it turned out neoliberal reform was compatible with the traditional way of doing politics. So despite the stunning about-face talking about embracing the Washington Consensus, there's little evidence that the Peronist party suffered a substantial erosion in its activist base. And this was because President Menem was able to make these two things work together. Okay, making the buffet. All right, so let me not go into the details. You got the idea. Okay, let me talk about Colombia, the Colombian frontier. So this is the municipality of Caballaro in Meta. It's in Meta. Buenos tiempos para todos. You reckon? Okay, here's the story. In 1997, now, of course, I think this example is interesting also because I want to say this is not just a kind of cynical political economy. There's a real sort of dysfunctionality going on here. Okay, so in 1997, the Colombian Land Reform Institute, INCORA, decides, to bring 85 people, to this one Vereda El Carpintero in Caballaro. They're mostly from the north of Colombia. They give them land title, they settle them on this land. Okay, it comes with an agricultural project, but the agricultural project said, well, we can only give you the agricultural project if all of the families come. All of the families didn't come. So here's one of the campesinos. They were going to give us an agricultural project. They never gave it to us. We couldn't work how we wanted because some people hadn't arrived. And if they didn't come, they couldn't give us the project. Okay? So already there's like a technical disqualification. Then what happened? These families get displaced by the paramilitaries. What does INCORA do? Oh, look, that land is vacant. There's no one there. They grant the same land to another 35 different families. Okay? So then what happens? Well, those families leave too because of paramilitaries. They also get displaced. Okay? This is somebody else from the second family being interviewed. They left because there was nothing there, not a single project. There was nothing to do. Okay? So all the complementary inputs never arose. Okay? So then what happens? Well, President Santos has his land restitution. Great. Except now there's two sets of people with title to exactly the same pieces of land. And what happens? They start fighting over restitution. Okay? Now, you could probably tell a political economy story of that, but most political economy stories I hear about INCORA are people bribing INCORA not to redistribute land, rather than redistributing land twice. Like for us, this just seems an example of like dysfunctionality. INCORA has these rules, it has these principles. It says, oh, if the land is vacant, you can grant it to... They try to implement these principles, and the reality with the paramilitaries displacing people, with, of course, some people don't show up, so you can't give the project because some families didn't, like, the ideal is messed up by the reality. Okay, so, all right, quick, let me not go into this too much. You sort of got the idea. I think, like, if I was going to talk more about the difference between North America and Latin America, and I'm going to resist commenting on that, we'd go back to the different incidents of the Counter-Reformation and how the same baroque kind of culture never impacted North America. And there's a feedback loop, a more pragmatic and empiricist culture kind of emerged. I think, if you read, like I'm talking about, like this is, here's the ideal and the real, the ideal, the beautiful city. That's why Rama's book is called La Ciudad Letrada. So he's very focused on the urban aspect, the urban manifestation of this ideal. You can see the beautifully planned city, with the roads and the squares, and then outside, it's like la voragine, to use a Colombian example. Okay, and he points out, if you look at the history of city construction in North America and Latin America, it's sort of strikingly different. In Latin America, the conquistadors like ran around the continent incredibly rapidly, founding these cities. If you think of all the cities in Colombia, all of the big cities were founded, most of them were founded very soon after the conquest, okay? In the United States, something totally different. You know, Chicago was founded in 1830, which was 223 years after the Jamestown colony. You know, it's a completely different way of like occupying space and kind of consolidating territory, you know, where, you know, he calls it like, what does he call it? A mad gallop, you know. The conquest triumphantly imposed its cities on a vast and unknown hinterland, you know, and this is just, because it's this utopian ideal of like we've conquered, but outside we haven't controlled. Okay, all right. So here's some implications. So I talked about this obedezco pero no cumplo. So let me give you some more implications, and I'll start with clientelism. So one of the best kind of ethnographic studies of clientelism is by Javier Aullero. Javier is a sociologist at the University of Texas at Austin, and he's been studying for 30 years one kind of peri-urban area in Buenos Aires, like looking at different aspects of the society. And one thing he looked at is he did an ethnography of the Peronist political machine. So they have a political machine. So he studies in great detail clientelism. So how would we think about clientelism? Well, think about this disequilibrium. Think about this A and not A, or the real and the ideal. There's going to be problems, okay? The Argentinian state promises services that actually it just can't possibly provide, you know, in the same way that Incora promises well-defined and secure property rights and doesn't deliver. So the disequilibrium creates dysfunction. So what does the clientelist machine do? It solves problems. And in fact, Aullero's preferred definition of clientelism is problem solving through personalized political mediation. And what he shows is that what the Peronist operatives do is arbitrage this disequilibrium. They intermediate between the people who think, oh, I have a right to that service, and then they go to the office and the office is closed. Well, there's nobody there. Or they tell them to come back on Monday. They come back on Monday and it's a holiday and there's nobody there. Or they go in and they say, well, yes, you're eligible for that service, but there's no money, so we can't give it to you. So this disequilibrium, what are the Peronists? They take up that space for you, okay? So you know, like, what are Peronist brokers? They're not seen as unscrupulous, corrupt politicians, but are good, helpful, self-sacrificing people with whom they have a personal relationship. It's not the government who gets them their jobs, grants them their pensions, buys medicine, finds them food. It's Matilda or Juancita or Andrea, okay? And they're seen as doing so not because they're under any obligation, but because they care. So clientelism emerges as a sort of arbitraging this disequilibrium, okay? So what's striking about Aullero's book is the lack of kind of, you know, it doesn't appear as a sort of course, they're getting votes in exchange for this. But there's a trade, there's an exchange, the Peronists get votes. But what creates the demand in Aullero's book for these services that the Peronists provide is this disequilibrium. Okay, let me come back to the Colombian, you know, frontier and talk about the Antillanora for a bit. So this is what went on in the Antillanora, you probably all know about this scandal, is a perfect example of like the real and the ideal. And in Colombia, you know, thanks to the liberal politician Dario Echandía, you have a beautiful expression for this, you know, which is the orangutan in the tuxedo. You know this expression? So Dario Echandía in the 1940s said, Colombian democracy is like an orangutan in a tuxedo, okay? So how can an orangutan in a tuxedo, wouldn't the orangutan like rip the tuxedo off, or wouldn't the tuxedo civilize the orangutan? No, they coexist, okay? That's Colombian democracy. And it's a perfect example of the coexistence of two apparently completely contradictory things, okay? the orangutan and, the tuxedo. Okay, so here's the tuxedo. I won't go into all the details of this, the exploitation of the Antillanora and the exploitation of, in some sense, the ideal by, Bigard and Urrutia, creating all of these shell companies so that, Colombian elites and international elites could basically illegally or legally acquire enormous amounts of land in the Antillanora by creating all these shell companies that didn't exist, basically. Okay, so here's the tuxedo, and and following the laws at some level. But you have to ask yourself, and here's Cargill getting in on the action too. The interesting thing is how they acquired the land, and that's where the orangutan comes in. Because if you look into the details of how they acquired the land, how Cargill acquired the land, or how even Bogotano elites acquired the land had to come from somewhere. What you see is enormous appreciation in the price of land. Okay, so for example, here's some examples. A 1,500 hectare parcel of land via Rosenda in the Antillanora was acquired for it was sold for $2 million in this exchange. So the shell company owned by Cargill paid a serious amount of money for the land, $2 million. But earlier that year, it had been acquired for $10,000. Okay. So let's say the land was worth $2 million and it was acquired for $10,000. Okay, so in between, the shell companies and the campesinos were intermediaries. Intermediaries, well, like who? I don't know exactly, but here's a guess at who, the kind of thing that went on. And this is El Alemán, Freddy Rendon Herrera, a paramilitary comandante, talking about, this similar processes. Today, the campesinos are trying to reclaim the land they sold very cheap. Yeah, but they sold it. And the businessmen, they bought it cheap. Yeah, but they bought it. So $10,000 is cheap. Okay, so this is the interface between the orangutan and the tuxedo, between two apparently completely inconsistent things. But here, they're working in synergy. They're working in synergy. There's a very old literature on the latifundia and the minifundia, for example. Another thing I could talk about would be this example of the latifundia and the minifundia, of how the latifundia and minifundia existed historically. So the orangutan in the tuxedo. Okay, here's the magical Venezuelan state. Okay, so this is Jose Ignacio Cabrujas, who was a Venezuelan playwright who wrote about this. And this is just really an example of utopianism. So his explanation for the kind of collapse of Venezuela and the rise of Chavismo was that in Venezuela you expect magic, and the oil economy had basically fueled this sense of utopia, that utopia was feasible and utopia was possible, and what he called the demand for magic. And he sort of says, it would be suicide for a presidential candidate in Venezuela not to promise us paradise, because the state has nothing to do with reality. The state is a magnanimous sorcerer. Okay. So how do you explain such a crazy thing? Well, from our perspective, this is utopianism. That the utopianism was fueled in Venezuela by this wealth, the oil abundance created this sense that anything was possible and the state could deliver it. We call this the demand for magic. Okay. So again, if you think about clientelism, you could think about Chavismo or whatever as a sort of political strategy or whatever. But here there's really a demand for magic. The people demand magic. This is what Cabrujas says. It's like it would be suicide for a presidential candidate not to promise everything. Paradise. Okay? So the politicians have to respond to the demand. People demand utopia. Okay? So maybe that's a way of thinking about populism also, and this is, he was pretty into, you know anything about Chavez, he was pretty into magic. Okay, and this is the ex-president, I think we can safely say, of Venezuela. But I couldn't resist this because it's such a great example. Maduro announces early start to Christmas. He moved Christmas, the start of Christmas to, why not? Why not? Anything is possible in Venezuela, as we saw. Okay, I could talk about, I'm not sure I want to talk about magical realism too much. Okay, so we want to think of, I won't talk about magical realism. I'm not sure I feel confident in talking about literature, but if Jose Luis was here, he'd talk about magical realism as an example of layering things that are mutually inconsistent somehow on top. And if you think about that that's a fantastic example of this plus one of the sort of creativity. And but let me talk about the informal sector as another example. So think about the informal sector. What's the informal sector? There's the formal, but the informal sector has rules, it has regulations, you have to comply, it's very complicated. So what do? Just go informal. Okay? So the formal and the informal, that's a bit like the latifundia and the minifundia. That's working on different principles next to each other, kind of maybe in synergy, maybe not. But we think of that also as, how would you think about that? That's also a kind of layering. That's a bit like coricancha, like the formal sector and the informal sector. The two of those things coexisting is coming from the same mechanism. Okay. I won't talk about that. Okay, and I won't talk about Alejo Carpentier, but if you read his work also, he traces this very much to the baroque. Okay, so if I back up a bit and sort of think about what I'm saying here, it's a bit of a different way of thinking about political economy. And in interpreting these examples, I'm sort of resisting a more Machiavellian interpretation. Okay, so you could tell stories about Peronism or what went on in Meta in a very Machiavellian way. It's all about power and it's about interests. But the point of the bicentennial example is to say you can't explain that by interests. So what's going on? I don't think you can explain that example in Meta through interests. People have interests involved, but that's not what's driving it. It's more dysfunctional than that. Okay, so we're trying to propose a way of sort of thinking about that dysfunction. Okay, so I think that's interesting, because it gives you much more room for maneuver than the traditional equilibrium of power and politics. Okay, it's not just about power and interest. There's a kind of disequilibrium. So that means there's actually much more scope for changing things if you can. I'm not proposing, I don't have a solution for how to do that, but it gives you much more scope for changing things because, in some sense, there's this clash between the real and the ideal, okay? And that's not just a matter of interest, it's a kind of disequilibrium. But I'm also trying to say, the ideal is not necessarily bad. There's the plus one. Let me go back to de Gaulle making fun of the Brazilians. Okay? Brazil is the country of the future and always will be. That comes from utopianism. But if you think utopianism is not such a bad thing, maybe it's not such a bad thing to think you're the country of the future. Because maybe if you think you're the country of the future, you achieve lots of things on the way to becoming, you don't ever become the country of the future, but on the way you achieve many things that you wouldn't have achieved had you not thought you were the country of the future. Okay, so let me end with one example, which should appeal to talking about what Latin Americans are good at, which is football. Okay, so if you go back about the history of Brazilian football, and go back to the 1958 World Cup, when the Brazilians, there's a beautiful, if you've never watched it, biography of Pelé, and so the manager of the Brazilian team tells the Brazilians, stop stop trying to play like Germans. You're not Germans. You're Brazilians. Play like Brazilians, okay? And what does that mean? And it means this, here's Pelé. It means you add capoeira, and the famous ginga, which is, the Brazilian way of playing football. Yes, madam, yes. So here's, Pelé doing the, ginga, and, this is an example of, like, syncretism or something, or it's a matter of making football Latin American by, like, adding Latin American characteristics. So we think this is an example of a +1, and this is also clearly, a positive aspect of this equilibrium, okay? So I think, we need to do a lot more work on the +1. I think when Jose Luis and I first started, we started with these examples of, like, things very dysfunctional. So how do we explain that? Okay, but then you realize, actually, it's not just about dysfunctional, that this is also a model of creativity and cultural innovation. And, I think that's an important side of this that we haven't thought enough about, that I hope we will do in the future. So I think that's all I have to say. And hopefully you got the idea, and I'll shut up and people can ask questions.
Bueno, muchas gracias a todos, muchas gracias James. Creo que está abierto a preguntas, entonces le vamos a pedir a quien quiera hacer preguntas que por favor levanten la mano y les vamos a dar un micrófono para que puedan hacer la pregunta. Acá, no. Allá arriba, al lado del...
Hi, thank you so much for your conference. It was really amazing. I'm Camilo Delgado, I'm an astrophysicist, but I really like the social problems. And when you do your analysis, did you include the thing that the latitude change in these countries as an input in your models? Because here is the tropical, the time here is stopping, and maybe this input could change a bit the conclusions, and it's a big difference between the country that has seasons, no, because it's a high latitude. So how this latitude changed the analysis that you did?
Okay, I mean, there's no statistical analysis here whatsoever. This is just, talking about ideas and trying to of course, there's lots of variation between different parts of Latin America. So, there's different adaptations of culture to different contexts, and so I think, there's variation, which I'm not talking about here. I'm talking about big sort of things which I claim are sort of common to many parts of Latin America. There's definite, variation in that. There's much less utopianism in Chile, for example, than there is in most parts of Latin America. But how it corresponds, this corresponds to topography or other things, I can't say. I don't have any analysis on that, and we haven't looked at that, and I'm not sure we will actually. But so I mean, in my other work, I've looked at things like that. But I just thought this is a sort of new direction, and I thought it might be fun to talk about this. But you're asking a question. I don't know the answer to that. Yeah.
So this is related to your previous work. So what about the ethnical diversity, ethnical fractionalization, and ethnical and cultural fusion, let's say? What's the role of these?
Yeah, but so I didn't talk about that, but in some sense, the +1 is a huge engine of cultural innovation in Latin America. Think of the whole idea of like mestizaje, which is totally missing in North America. Like all of this, think about the casta, these famous Mexican casta paintings. That's all like indigenous, black, Spanish, like all added. They're different combinations of like the people, So I think this cultural adding, like that's a very Latin American thing. Like adding peoples, creating mestizaje, like adding culture, to like Borges said, what is Latin American culture? Latin American culture is basically everything. It's like French culture, German culture, English culture, indigenous culture, Spanish culture, Japanese culture. It's like everything, okay? Now, so here's an example. Here's an example of why that's interesting, Like, you think about many international laws, or even the concept of international law, actually came from Latin America. 1826, Bolivar convened this conference in Panama, and one thing they decided in Panama was that the boundaries of all these Latin American countries would adopt. They adapted a principle from Roman law, and they said the boundaries of these states are going to follow the viceroyalties. Because the Latin Americans had to deal with each other in a way North Americans never did. They had to adjust to this equilibrium of different states. And one way of thinking about why they were able to do that is because they were so internationalized in their culture. They had already added this and that, and they had many different cultural identities. And that made it possible for them to reach this equilibrium of recognizing boundaries, recognizing sovereignty. Okay? That principle, 1826, that was when the Organization of African States was founded in Ethiopia in the 1950s. They adopted exactly the same principle that Bolivar had created. Actually, it was the Colombians created this before in Santander, I think Santander's government. And Bolivar adopted it. They used exactly the same principle to say, how are we going to divide Africa? We recognize these colonial boundaries the same way the Latin Americans did. So actually, Latin American culture kind of created a principle that dominated international law in the last 200 years. So I think, I know I'm not talking about what you wanted me to talk about. But I think that's actually this whole issue of fragmentation and stuff is very interesting in Latin America, and it's very related, as you probably understood, to this idea of kind of adding and sort of mestizaje and how that's related to sort of institution. I'm trying to say that's related to lots of things that you hadn't realized it's related to. But I think that's an example, actually, this mestizaje is an example of kind of like the +1 in a very different sphere, in the sphere of international relations. It allowed the Latin Americans to reach an equilibrium that was very difficult to reach in other parts of the world because of this, Yes, didn't answer your question.
Hi, James. I have a question, and I'm really interested because you talk about meta, and we came from there. And there is a place when you talk about the ideal and the real, and I want you to explain us how you see that in meta. One thing, because we recognize that meta has, it is an oil economy, and we see some municipes like us, Puerto Gaitan, we see some interaction between indigenous, between Menonitas, I guess, and also between external companies. So how does relation, because we with my University of the Llanos, we were there, and we interviewed people, and people were they have a set of ideas of the concept of the ideal of what should be Puerto Gaitan, how should mix with the oil economy, and the concept of that place, that territory in meta is really interesting. So if you know about Puerto Gaitan or about meta, how you see the real and the ideal.
It's super difficult the acoustics are really difficult, so I'm not sure I actually understood the question very well. Can someone, did you get the question, Leopoldo? In Puerto Gaitan?
Or in meta, in general.
In Colombia?
in the meta department, we talk about Caballero, meta, Porto Gaitan.
Well, I mean, I think you see the real and the ideal everywhere in Colombia. You know, let me give you an example, you know, which I've talked about today already in a different context. You know, in Colombia, they had this, very recently, there was the Misión Rural, which was, you know, Jose Antonio Campo was like in charge of this. So I went to a seminar at the Jorge Tadeo Lozano about the Misión Rural were presenting their results. And they came with a, Jose Antonio stood up and he had 50 PowerPoint slides with bullet points, 6 bullet points on each PowerPoint, on each slide, with all of the policies that were going to be implemented. Okay, so this is the utopian plan to reorganize, yet another utopian plan to reorganize the Colombian frontier. Okay, and so I asked him on slide 8, you know, bullet point. I don't want to just pick on Jose Antonio, but it's just that, you know, because everyone thinks like this. But like, it's just a very clear example in my mind. On the slide 8, bullet point 4, I'm making that up, but it's approximately correct. It said, it said, we will give a title to every rural Colombian landowner. Okay. Now, that's ridiculous. Right? You know that is never going to happen. Everybody in this room knows it's never going to happen. But it's a great utopian ideal to have. But I put my hand up and I said, oh, Jose Antonio, how is that ever? Tell me how the Colombian state is going to implement that. Explain to me, like, the administrative, you know, how do you do that? You know, like if you look at the United States, you look at the Homestead Act. United States, in the Homestead Act, they gave out titles to millions of people through the Homestead Act. There was an enormously complicated bureaucracy and administration mapping, you know, like constructed to make that happen. Misión Rural had absolutely no plan for creating such an administration, okay? But he just thought I was crazy. He looked at me and said, we're going to pass a law, that's what we're going to do. And that's how he really thought. And, you know, and I don't think it's just him. You know, in fact, at the conference, there was a gentleman who was an advisor to the FARC, and he came up to me in the coffee and he said, oh, you're just a neoliberal guy, aren't you? You hate the government. You don't want the government to give land titles. And I said, I love the government. I just know the Colombian government is never going to do that, okay? So I don't think Jose Antonio is totally well-intentioned, but he has this mindset, this utopian mindset of how to do things. This is how we do things. In Colombia, we pass laws and we don't have a concept of implementation. Why is that? I'm trying to understand that in some sense. So you may think, I'm trying to make progress on that. That's not about interests. It's not about, Jose Antonio was not doing that because he had some perverse interest. He was doing it because he thought it was the right thing to do. But like, from my perspective, it was ludicrous. But he just, you know, so that's a very concrete example. I could give many, many others, you know. There's a wonderful book, if you're interested, like by Simón Uribe, who's an anthropologist at the Externado, called I don't know what the title is in Spanish, but in English, the title is Frontier Road. And it's about why there's no road to Mocoa, basically. And it's another story like this, you know, in Putumayo. If you like this topic, you'll love that book. Yes.
Oh, thank you. Right here, Jim. Leopoldo, here in the first row. Thank you for such an interesting talk, super thought-provoking, and definitely when one thinks about Latin America, for instance, as being a world superpower in terms of culture and how much culture it exports, I think about this +1 that you're mentioning and the immense source of creativity that emerged from this. I just wanted to kind of see your reaction to one thought, which is going back to your building blocks of being able to add A as not A as being one distinctive feature. One could think of other societies doing that as well. So even if you think of very functional societies and very kind of ordered societies, like if I go to Europe, you could say, well, constitutional monarchies, aren't they sort of adding A to not A? Or aren't they very ancient, but at the same time modern cities very much adding A, not A? So I was wondering if the answer to that is yes, to some extent, then what is distinctive about Latin America? Is this thing with the ideal? Is it the way we add A with not A? Yeah, I just wanted to hear your reactions to that.
I think it's a matter of degree in some sense. I think, like, you know, if you thought about the US and you thought about, you know, like Latin America, you know, it's a matter of degree. It's not like it's not as, you know, like this. What I'm saying is there's a kind of feedback loop, you know. So there's a feedback loop in the US. It's kind of more empirical. It's more pragmatic. You kind of learn from this disequilibrium and you sort of adjust. So you could sort of say, yeah, you know, we have a monarchy in Britain, but we didn't kind of we didn't have an absolute monarchy and like put a parliamentary democracy in parallel to it. We kind of weakened the absolute monarchy as we strengthened the parliament. So we kind of adjusted the two to a more functional relationship rather than just kind of put them alongside each other, you know, or, you know, and that's not necessarily good. You know, think about the United States again. Think about the treatment of indigenous people in the United States. You know, in Spanish America, you had the República de Indias and the República de Españoles, you know. So indigenous people actually had kind of rights that indigenous people in the United States did not have at all. In fact, you know, like indigenous people were expropriated, they couldn't vote, they had no political rights, they couldn't access the legal system in the way that indigenous people, not to say that indigenous people were not exploited in Latin America, they were, but it's actually an interesting situation, it's an interesting difference with the United States. That indigenous people could access legal institutions in Latin America that indigenous people in the United States could not access at all. They had no rights as citizens until like the 1920s. You know, so I think, you know, you could sort of say that's a matter of degree. And, you know, in that case, I'll give you that example because I'm not saying that's a good thing. You know, that in the US there was a sort of feedback loop, like we want to really expropriate the indigenous people and exploit them, so we're going to adjust, you know, kind of thing. So in that case, I think the Spanish situation is actually, the Latin American situation is far superior to what happened in the United States, in fact. But I guess that's how I think about it.
Hello. Hello. Okay. Here. First of all, good afternoon, Mr. Robinson. It's clearly, for me, a pleasure to be asking to you today. I'm right here.
Sorry, I can't see
right
anything.
Here. Upstairs?
Okay,
yes, sir, I'm right
okay,
here.
okay.
So, as I said, it's a pleasure to be talking to you right now. I want to do a kind of a funny intervention that at 8 a.m. today, me with my classmates at General Economic History, we were seeing like your work when we were studying your work on Why Nations Fail. So it's kind of funny being or talking to you today. But my question is related to kind of the understanding or the kind of my way of understanding of the information you gave us today. That is kind of Latin Americans have kind of a contrarian way of thinking. We are not going or playing by the rules or playing by the book, by exemplified by the example you gave of obedezco pero no cumplo. That is kind of the example that I base this on. So my question on that is there a way for Latin Americans to transform a contrarian way of thinking into a tool of innovation or at least improvement?
Yeah, but you know, I think what I'm trying to say is it is a way of innovating, actually, you know, at least in some domains. You know, it is, you know, I've been giving examples. I mean, I ended with football. You know, you might or might not like that example, you know. But, you know, I just gave this example of international law. You know, that's a really first-order example, you know. I think about, you know, you might not like ceviche either, you know, or magical realism, you know. But I could give economic examples, too. So here's a Colombian economic example. So about 20 years ago, the FARC basically put this vacuna on, like, all the companies like Bavaria and Alpina and whatever, and they said, like, if you want to sell, you know, Bavaria in these municipalities, you have to pay this vacuna. And then, like, the companies said, of course, no, we're not paying that, okay? And then there was this story in El Tiempo, like, you know, there's 80 municipios sin pola or something. Okay, that's like a national crisis. Now, you're probably not old enough to have seen the Cerveza Águila advertisement. But there used to be an advertisement for Cerveza Águila where like you were in this like little pueblo and everyone was like angry and like complaining. And the reason was there was no Cerveza Águila. And then somebody says, shh, shh, shh. And he puts his, you know, they've seen this advertisement. He puts his head on the tarmac. It's coming. The Cerveza Águila truck is coming. Now, that is totally phony, that advertisement, because actually, that's not how beer gets delivered into the territorios in Colombia. The beer gets delivered in the following way. The big companies sell it to intermediaries, and the intermediaries sell it to the informal sector. And individuals in trucks go out to Catatumbo, or whatever it is, and they deliver the beer to the... And when the FARC banned Pola from these municipalities, what happened? Was there no Pola? No. Colombians got the beer to how? In taxis, you know, in the... it says, I think in the El Tempo article, it says something like transportes ocultos. Like the beer got there. Anyway, the informal sector delivered the beer, okay? The informal sector delivered the beer. And the informal sector delivers the beer and the postobon and lots of other things anyway, now, all the time, okay? I've never been in a Colombian municipality where there wasn't like beer and, you know, like Britannia. So, like, that's the informal sector. That's the informal sector and the formal sector kind of working together. But is that a bad thing? I'm not sure it's a bad thing. You know, I think it's like, it's a synergy between the two, okay? So I think that's an economic example. I could give more economic examples like that if you don't like ceviche or international law. But I think, like, we're working on it, you know, or football. I thought you'd like football. We're working, you know, but so I think it is. Now, of course, there's lots of bad things too. There's clientelism, there's this dysfunctionality, you know, which I talked about in Meta, or, you know, there's neoliberal reform in Argentina. You know, I don't know what your view is, but my view is it's going to be a total and utter disaster. So I think that's the problem, how to keep the good things and how to reduce the bad things or mitigate the bad things or get the bad things. That's the way I think about it.
James, first of all, I want to start up over here up top. I want to start up just as he did by thanking you. I think everyone here is familiar with your previous work, so it's really significant for you to be here. Now, I was really wondering about what you talked about in the end, about the kind of unhealthy utopianism that is in Latin America, just as you did with the example you talked about with José Antonio Campo. But my question is, since it's so widespread and so ubiquitous in Latin America, so deep inside of the culture, do you see a way out? Do you see a way in which we can be a bit more pragmatic rather than utopic, with this sort of utopianism that has been holding us back?
That's academic jinga. I don't know. You know, I don't know what the answer to that is. Like, I think, you know, in the story I'm trying to tell, there's lots of pluses here. There's lots of good things as well as bad things. You know, so I think the point is to keep the good things, you know, and mitigate the bad things, as I was saying to this gentleman. I don't know. I think if I guess if you become conscious of this, you know, if you just understand it better, you know, like academics, we're in the business of trying to understand things and help people understand things. If you understand it better, or you understand the mechanisms better, then, you know, then you have a way of trying to think about how we adjust to this, or how we work more effectively, and how we keep the good things, and, you know, mitigate the bad things, you know. But I think there's, you know, and I think that's what, you know, as academics, that's what we can offer, kind of, you know, just to sort of get people to think about this. You know, I remember, like, here's another example, like from Bogota, you know, which if you read Rama's book, which you definitely should, you know, if you like this talk, you know, he gives Bogota as an example of like the perfect Latin American city. But think about El Cartucho, you know, El Cartucho. Like, we have a problem. We have El Cartucho. What do we do about the problem? We eliminate El Cartucho and we just have this wonderful, like, whatever it is, okay? What happens when you do that? El Cartucho just moves somewhere else, you know? So, so there's different ways of interpreting that, you know, but again, that was a sort of utopian, we can get rid of El Cartucho just by doing this, you know, and redesigning the, you know. So I don't know if you like that example, but I'm not sure, we have to think, I don't have an answer to that, you know, like, and I think by trying to emphasize the good things of it, you know, like that, you get it into perspective. Like, and here's one thing I can say, you know, 130 years ago, you know, Jose Marti wrote an essay, you know, or Nuestra America, you probably read, some of you may have read this, about how Latin America couldn't succeed by just copying, you know, the gringos, basically. But there's been a lot of emphasis put on copying the gringos, you know. And maybe there's a different story here of, like, our reality is different. So it's not just about copying the Washington Consensus or copying US institutions, which, by the way, are not working so well at the moment. It's about, you know, Marti sort of says, you know, it's about finding something that fits our own cultural reality. You know, I guess that's what I'm talking about. Now, I don't have a simple recipe for that or a solution for that, or but I think that's what you have to think about. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your talk. I will try to make a brief summary of your talk, and you'll please tell me whether my summary is fair.
Yeah, no, this is even brighter here.
Essentially, I think that what you're saying is that we Latin Americans are illogical people, that we're trying to square A with not A, and in that process we get mad, we get a cultural confusion or crisis, and that this cultural crisis is creative. It produces nice soccer, produces good food, produces clientelism. This is basically the summary.
Yeah, I'm actually saying Latin Americans are very good at kind of tolerating mutually inconsistent things. But mutually inconsistent things cause a mess. And you have to react to the mess. How do you react to the mess? By coming with a new plan. You know, that's my constitution example. By coming with a new utopian kind of plan. So, you know, so there's a mess, and it's the way you know, you don't adjust to the mess. You just bring a new mess, if you like. So, but I think Latin Americans are very good at, you know, that's what magical realism is about. You know, think of 100 years of solitude. You know, like, what's 100 years of solitude? Like, people are living with these parallel realities, you know, of like magic and, you know, real and magic, and, you know, but they're living quite happily with those things. Yeah.
Okay. Your lecture was very clear, explaining how clientelism arises from this contest between the ideal and the real. But I didn't get the idea very well of how inequality arises from that. So if you could explain that a little bit more, I would appreciate it. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, yes. No, I mean, I think there's many mechanisms, but the particular example I was talking about, you know, which is, you know, the orangutan in the tuxedo, that, you know, that's a mechanism for elites to loot the resources of the periphery in Colombia. You know, what happened in the Antillanora is that powerful people, you know, American multinationals and powerful people in Colombia looted, you know, land in Los Llanos, you know. So you can, just as the Peronists can kind of arbitrage, you know, this disequilibrium, so can sophisticated and powerful people, you know. That's also a case of arbitraging and accumulating assets. So that's, thank you. I didn't explain well enough how that was connected to inequality. So that's also, you know, that's the mechanism I had in mind there. But I think this image of the orangutan in the tuxedo is just such a perfect example of, like, that you see that in Colombia all the time, of this, you know, how is it that these things, many things like that coincide, like live alongside each other in Colombian society, and how why is it one doesn't eliminate the other? We're sort of trying to explain, you know, why is that? Yeah, but yeah, thank you.
Hi. Very, yeah. Thank you, James, for the talk. Super inspiring. We're so, at least I am trying to grasp the complexity of the reasoning. So the first question connects a lot to Leopoldo's point. Is it very much a specificity of Latin America? I understand there are different levels. Or does it tend to be a specificity of all colonized countries and past colonies? I'm thinking in Africa, for example, where there were strong pre-colonial cultures, and then there were borders that were set on them that don't fit with initial tribe divisions and initial cultures. There is local institutions that try to live together with the institutions imposed. So they have, the first question is, does it apply at least as well to other colonized countries at some point in their history? Or maybe you think that in Africa they were more able to force out the initial institutions at the point that it's not as strong as now? And the second question would be, it sounds like part of the solution to keep the best and solve the misfunctioning has a lot to do with improving the feedback loop. But the concept of why some places have US had a better feedback loop than Latin America, what are the roots of this? Is it connected to the usual, in the private sector, people can vote with their feet, but in the public one, they can't, so you don't really know what's working or not unless you have well-functioning institutions, but then the institutions here are not as well-functioning because of vote buying and other issues? Or what are the roots of these not-so-good feedback loop in Latin America? How do you explain this?
Well, I mean, the general argument, so there's two questions there. How does this apply in other parts of the world? I guess, the parts of the world where I've experienced this, like the Philippines, but the Philippines is just like Latin America at some level, and the history is like Latin America, and it really has this sort of very similar kind of cultural, feel to it, the Philippines. I think the Africa case, I think like you don't have this kind of immense impact of Catholicism and the baroque and so I started with Coricancha and stuff because I think like religion here plays a big role, because we're saying that like this is tied to the Counter-Reformation and the baroque, and that's in the psyche of Latin Americans, and then you just get used to this. You don't see these contradictions, so you layer things on top of each other, So like I don't think that's in the mindset of Africans. I mean, you certainly have religious syncretism in Africa, but just to give you an example of like what I see about religious syncretism in Africa, it's much more dominated by African religion than it is by Christianity. So for example, in Nigeria, so everyone in Nigeria says they're Christian. Like everyone I know who I work with in Nigeria, if you ask them were they Christians, they say they're Christians. Oh yes, we're Christians. But they all go to diviners and religious shrines and local gods, and they make whatever they had, ancestral shrines, in their home, and so they all worship traditional deities also. Okay, so how do you reconcile that? So in Eastern Nigeria, the big god is called Chukwu. Okay, so how do you reconcile those two things? If you ask a Catholic priest, for example, a Catholic priest will tell you, well, Chukwu is really God of the Bible, the Hebrew God of the Bible, who appears to different people in different guises. So the Catholics really gave up in Nigeria. Like you can't persuade these Africans to really like become Christians, so you have to pretend they're Christians by pretending their God actually is the same God as the Bible, and then we're fine. So it's not like there is no religious syncretism, because really what you're doing is just a version of Catholicism. So that seems kind of crazy to me, but any Catholic priest will tell you that in Nigeria. I mean, my sample is not huge, but independently you ask people. And so here's the thing about that also. So I feel like the African religions have all the bargaining power. And one thing about African religion is like if you go to a god, a deity, and you sacrifice to a deity and you ask, you try, and the deity doesn't deliver, you give up on the deity and you go to another deity. And religion, Christianity is like that too. You know, if the Catholic Church doesn't deliver, you go to a Pentecostalist church. And if the Pentecostalists don't deliver, you try the Protestants, you know. And different sects of Protestantism, lots of different sorts of Pentecostals. You kind of religion shop, you know. That's very common. And that's very, very ingrained in African traditional religious practices, you know. So there's a syncretism, but it's very different, I think, from religious syncretism in Latin America. And I think that has something to do with the fact that Latin America was colonized for such a long time, you know, and it was, the Catholic Church was sort of hegemonic in Latin America in a way that Christian churches were never hegemonic in Africa. They were very sort of superficial, you know, over African society. And of course, there's other parts of the world, you know, fascinatingly enough, where Christianity had like no traction whatsoever, like Japan, China, you know, where nobody converted, or South Asia, you know, particularly, where very few people converted to Christianity. But I think, like, you know, I guess the way I'm telling this story, you know, I might change my mind, is a very, you know, it's tied to this baroque and the Counter-Reformation. And so you would say, you know, that is going to be limited to a particular kind of slice of world society in some sense. And I think, like, you know, the way, I mean, I don't have detailed examples in the United States. We should do that. But, you know, the way I just want you to think about the United States is like this more pragmatic, you know, but Americans never had this mentality of like the baroque, of like adding and layering and these, you know, that was never the sort of philosophy in some sense that came with, you know, colonization of the United States. So you never start with that attitude. But we've done much less research on the United States at the moment. So I just wanted to give you a kind of flavor of how we'd explain those comparative facts but I can't really answer the question you're answering, which is more about like, what does that look like in a kind of more micro level with the mechanisms? And
Hi, yeah, so from the answer purple glasses, that's me, yes. So from the answer you just gave, I'm most certain that you're gonna answer, I don't know, but I'm still gonna do it. And it's like from an economical, like international political perspective, you might say, I don't know if you heard the speech in Davos from Canada's Prime Minister, and like in general, the international economic order that we are seeing at the moment. I think that the narrative that you just gave in terms of ideal and real, it has a lot of like transcendent in Latin America. So with that context, with everything and all the like problems that we're seeing at the moment, do you think that this is an opportunity, or like it is constraining this disequilibrium, or like chances for changing and transformation in Latin America, like at least the narrative?
I think it's a very important moment for strengthening, you know, your sense of what's important and what's good about Latin America. You know, the United States is sort of in a process of self-destruction. You know, we don't know how far down that's going to go, and your guess is probably as good as mine, you know. But, you know, Latin America is sort of facing a kind of reversion, you know, to pre-1990 US policy, you know. I mean, it was the United States that kept Rafael Trujillo in power, and the República Dominicana that put Somozas into power. You know, like, this is the new equilibrium in Venezuela, you know. Like, it's familiar. If you go back in history, you see it's familiar, you know. When the US overthrew, you know, the Arbenz government in Guatemala in the 1950s, you know, the Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, and the head of the FBI, Alan Dulles, his brother, had massive economic interests in the United Fruit Company, you know. So if you take a historical perspective, we're sort of going back, you know, that's not a great equilibrium for Latin America, seems to me, you know. Like, so you had a window after 1990 where Latin America wasn't treated like that, and, you know, perhaps that was a lost opportunity. But I guess what I'm saying here also is, like, the 1990s also came with this intensified idea of we have to be like the United States. You know, we have to converge to the United States. You know, we have to be like the United States. And I guess what I'm saying here is you're not like the United States, actually. So maybe maybe there's bits and pieces that work, and bits and pieces you can choose, and you take one thing and not the other thing. And, you know, and But you have to have confidence to do that. You know, you have to have confidence to do that. And to have confidence to do that, you have to be very conscious of your strengths and capabilities. You know, I was talking about this international law because Jose Luis and I have just been reading about that. I'm not a legal scholar. I'm terrified that somebody's going to contradict me here. You know, but you know, at the time of the US invasion of Iraq, George W. Bush tried to get Latin American governments all kind of gung-ho about this, and they didn't want to know, you know. And the Minister of Defense in Brazil told him, Brazil has no enemies. That's a very deeply rooted thing in Latin American culture, that's what I'm saying. Okay? And that's a great thing.
Thank you, Professor, for your presentation. It was very interesting. I was wondering how we can use that +1 we get from the fundamental disequilibrium, the creativity, to help with the other problems we get from the disequilibrium itself. I am thinking of social protection systems. They tend to be very traditional in the region, and they're an example of the ideal. They cater to the formal workers, which are only a minority of all the workers, and they leave a very large segment of the population out of any kind of benefit. So how do we make those ideal turn into real using that creativity that we have?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have the answer to that, obviously, you know.
That's okay.
I do think it's worth thinking also that, as I said, you know, it could be good to be utopian. You know, like de Gaulle thought he was making fun of the Brazilians, you know. But I actually think, you know, it's good that Brazil is the country of the future, you know, because England is definitely not the country of the future. And I think it would actually be good if the British, of course, that, you know, the British, at some point they did think that, and it created a huge amount of misery in the rest of the world, you know. But I think, you know, if you thought about the history of, like, even of Colombia, you know, if you thought about the history of initiatives, think about the 1991 Constitution. The 1991 Constitution, in many ways, was utopian, you know. Even the, you know, but there's some positives. Think about the rights of indigenous people. Think about how indigenous people have been able to gain collective title to their land, okay? You might have thought that was a kind of it was sort of vague in the Constitution, but then it was made into something concrete and operational, and it worked, you know, and that's been a fantastic thing. And think about that, you know, think about that from the perspective of, like, the elite model of the political economy of Colombia. Like, who thought they'd just give away all that land, you know? So that, you know, so that, you know, there are instances like that of utopianism actually has a positive effect. Let's do something for indigenous people and for Afro-Colombians. And that turned out to be a great thing, you know, but you have to make it happen. Like there, you know, the story is, okay, the utopian dream created this thing, let's seize it, let's make it happen, let's make it operational, let's actually turn it into something real. So maybe that's actually a really interesting instance where something utopian turns into something real and, like, very positive for the country.
Hi, James here. Thanks very much. It was very thought-provoking. I very much buy the overlapping utopias ideas and see a lot of other examples that we could probably bring up. One is the coincidence of the real of the informal sector with the utopia of the labor regulation that we have for labor protection that people just pointed out. The thing that I still don't square is inequality. And I heard your answer, but to me it sort of sounded more parallel to the story than sort of intertwined with it. And one particular problem I have with the intertwining the two ideas is that the way I heard you, I sort of interpreted that the informal sector in that trap is sort of the intermediary that allows the coexistence of these different utopias in many of the contexts where this arises. But then the coincidence between informality and low income, if you think about income inequality, if that's the inequality that you're worried about, doesn't seem to square with the idea that the informal is sort of in the middle of this. So how, is there a way to square the intermediate or intermediary role of informality with the fact that it also coincides with the poorest sort of segment in general in our societies?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have an answer for that either. I'm just trying to think. I mean, I gave this gentleman an example of like how, the informal sector can do things that the formal sector can't do, And if you look at how all that works, actually, it's sort of using, social relations and social networks and, like to deliver goods. And it's outside of the kind of formal market, transactions using like reputational mechanisms. And so it achieves something that the formal sector doesn't do, okay? But you're right that, generally you could say, well, the informal sector has lower productivity and people are poorer in the informal sector and, and probably they would like to get into the formal sector. So there's also a downside of that, like clientelism, like, many of these other things I'm saying. So maybe, the good thing, I gave an example of the good things, but, maybe the bad things dominate the good things. Also, I was just trying to get you to think of the informal sector as another example of like these two things kind of one goes beside the other and neither eliminates the other. They sort of go on together, but that's somehow an example of something much more broader, I was saying. But point well taken, yes.
Bueno, muchas gracias a todos. Creo que con esto agradecemos a James, obviamente, por la charla, con muchas preguntas que nos deja pensando y terminamos por hoy la conferencia. Muchas gracias a todos.
Más fácil.
Fire, burning, stay up, gunman. Hey, I'm feeling I just wanna taste that the feeling you don't wanna wait. I know that you want me here.